Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a lovely day today, no matter what it is you're doing. For the tutorial today, following on from a short I released a few weeks ago, we're going to be learning how to make sword number 2. So I hope that you enjoy this as much as I do. Let's head down to the board and get cracking. So sword number 2 was the one that was chosen most often to be made next. I will be making sword number 4 in a couple of weeks. So we're working with 2 gauges of wire today. I'm going to be using 1mm or 18 gauge wire for the main part of the sword, and then I'm going to be providing the binding in a half round 0.6 gauge or 22 gauge. Now this can be achieved with a round wire if you don't have any half round. It just looks really nice with that semi-machined looking half round wire, so it's up to you whichever one you want to use. So we're starting with around about 18 inches of that 1mm 18 gauge wire, and that may be slightly more than we need, but it's just in case you want to create a slightly larger sword than I'm going to be using today. So let's just pop one up in the corner there, and we'll pop that one next to it. See how long it lasts before I knock them over. So as with all wire projects, it really does pay to prepare your wire just by giving that a little bit of a smooth through to get it good and fluid. We're going to be starting at the head end of the sword. Now I don't know the proper words for sword parts, so as far as I'm concerned, that's a hilt, that's a blade, those are the sidey bits, and that's the tip of the handle part. So there you go, technical terminology. If you want to correct me, feel free. We're going to be starting by creating a lovely swooshing round spiral. So using those round nose pliers, always making sure that you're starting with good flush cuts to your wire. Now you can make this larger, you can make it smaller, it's entirely up to you. I think I'm going to go around probably 3 times. The wire I'm using today is copper colour copper core wire. It's reasonably soft. You could use a raw copper if you prefer. And we're just going to move slowly around until we have that triple circular rotation. It's just once around, twice around and 3 times, and then I'm going to draw the wire away. Now normally I would use my pliers to get a really good straight line, but I actually want it to slightly float away just for the time being. And the reason I'm doing that is it makes it slightly easier later on when we build more of that sword shape. So let me just flip that over. What I might do, I've got an awful lot of wire on this end and it's just catching on the underside of my desk. So I'm going to just very, very gently move that around. It's a buttery soft wire today because it's extra warm here in the UK. So if you are going to create a little coil like that, it does pay to just warm it through first. I've already warmed mine through, so it's all good. So I'm just going to put a little bit more heat into the next section we're going to be working with before I draw the wire out at a right angle to create that first side of the handles. It's not a handle, the bar, the cross part. So let's just hold that in position and then push the wire away at a right angle. So I do want that to be quite a firm bend just at this stage. So what I'm going to do is grip that angle we've just made and push the wire back past where I need it to sit and then draw it straight up again. And in that way you get a slightly firmer angle just down there in the 90-degree section. The next thing we're going to do is to create a little ball on the end. Now again, I don't know the correct terminology for swords, but I'm just going to bring the wire up at a right angle to begin with. I don't need it to be a sharp angle this time, so I'm leaving that relatively soft before I drop those pliers in and rotate the pliers around, or you can rotate the wire around. Now that's sitting up quite high. You can, let's just bring that down a second, you can leave the ball section back towards the handle, or you can ensure that it sits symmetrically so that the ball sits at the end of the handle. So I'm going to put an angle in and then just move that over slightly so that it sits on the end of the little spar that's coming out to one side. And I'm just going to give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze to get those 2 wires to sit side by side. You can take a lot more time than I am to just refine those angles. And then what we're going to do, we're just going to turn it on its upside down so that I can get the sword continuing down towards the blade section. Now if I pop my pliers just into the central section here, what I want to do is to have the blade wire slightly further away towards the ball section on that cross member. So if I push the pliers around, you'll see that it's slightly further over to the left, and that's exactly what I want. I want a bit more space down the centre of the blade later on. Almost picked up the wrong pliers. What I'm going to do is just refine this angle now. This is another one I want to be quite a sharp angle. So if I push that wire past where I need it to sit and then bring it back again, you can refine the wire. If you prefer, of course, you can use a slightly heavier wire. This one in the darker colour is a 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire, and this is the 18 gauge 1mm wire. So you've got choices, whatever really works best for you, whatever you have available. I'm just going to grip that section where everything crosses over in the middle and put a little bit of strength into that section. You can of course hammer this before you add your banding or your binding wire later on, whatever makes you happy. Now for this design, this is sword number 2, I slightly flared the blade out towards the tip. And that's just a design aesthetic. I don't have any idea whether or not there's a sword that is shaped like this. I am not a sword expert. I just like making things with wire. So I'm going to hold the wire that's coming away towards the elongated section that we have all coiled up. And I'm just going to push the wire way past where I want it to sit and then draw it back out towards that imaginary end point. And that's so I get a really nice sharp angle just here. Now we are trying to create in the flat in 2 dimensions, so working as if you're between 2 panes of glass is how to think about it. We're not making any angles that come up and away at this stage. What we do need to do now is just replicate this in reverse. So what I'm going to do is at the tip, I'm going to turn the wire back up, bring it back up to just outside that central area, turn left, create another ball on the end, come back towards the centre, and then we're going to take the wire up towards the hilt of the blade. I'm aware that my videos can be quite lengthy, so what we're doing is just a repeat of the first side but in reverse. It's exactly the same techniques that I've just shown you, just to create a mirror image. Once I've taken that wire back up to that spiral at the top of the hilt, then I will rejoin you and we can work on the next section together. So I've endeavoured to keep that looking as similar as possible on either side. I think I've made the little blade end of this sword a tad too wide, but I'm not going to worry about it because it just means that you'll be able to see what's happening that little bit easier. What you can do if you want to is just play around with these angles and make sure that everything is exactly where you want it to sit. You can make the blade slightly more elongated, pressing that very, very gently down, always keeping in mind that we want to keep that wire flat and in the 2 dimensions. So I've still got that long tail of wire up at the top. This is very much more wire than we needed, but just in case you wanted to make a slightly larger sword, there's plenty available to play with. So the next thing that we're going to do is to draw the wire back down the centre of the sword, and we want that to occur just underneath this circular form up at the top. And what I'm going to do is pop my pliers underneath, grip that elongated section of wire and draw that around. And I want it to kind of replicate the smoothness of the line coming away from that spiral form, and drop that down over the top. Now it's just a little bit tricky to show you with that long tail of wire on, so I'm just going to push that over, draw the tail of wire away, and I'm just going to trim the majority of that away. And what we're going to do is play with this form until we get that to sit neatly. So you may need to bring that turn, that little racetrack hairpin down a little bit further so that it nestles inside that smooth shape up at the top. Once you're happy with where that bend takes place, making sure that your 2 cross beams are the same height, let's just straighten that up a slight second. There we go. So I think I probably need to take that down just a tiny bit further. Bring that all the way down so that it sits at the centre of the blade. That looks like it's going to work. If you find that you can't change this bend, you might be able to change the bend at the top instead. So I'll straighten that up and then push that away slightly higher up. So we're going to form fit those two pieces together. What we need to do now is to squish this section, this hairpin section, until it's much closer. So because the wire is super soft today, I'm going to need to take control of that racetrack hairpin. You might like to do that with a second pair of pliers. So if I hold that in between the tip of my other chain nose pliers, what I'm going to do now is just very, very gently close this section at the top up. You'll notice that the end is kicking out, but don't worry about that. I've brought that really close together. We're going to band that together in just a moment with that half round wire. But let's right now work on getting this form perfect. So what we need to do is to bring the last little section of wire flat against what is the, as you're looking at it, left hand side of the sword form. So I'm just going to push that until it sits slightly underneath and then draw that wire away very, very gently. I'm just curving it away for the moment, so that it sits behind the sword as we were looking at it a second ago. So what we want to do is to make sure that that is good and straight. And you can see at the moment the top is not lining up. So the first thing I'm going to do is to make sure that this first section of the sword that comes away from the round coil is straight and upright. And then I'm going to push the spiral over the top slightly. So if I hold that straight section and then just pull the spiral gently over, I'm looking to centralise that spiral over the top. And you can see that's coming together. I just need to take a few minutes to make sure that everything is absolutely straight. The straighter it is, the easier it will be to neatly band it all together. So that's starting to look like it will work quite nicely. You'll notice I haven't got that hard angle that I often have when I'm making spirals with a straight line coming away from them. In fact, if you want to, you can open that out slightly to make your life easier in just a moment. What I need to do is pull this very, very gently over so that it centralises up at the top. That's all looking pretty straight to me. Get that into the light. You can take a lot more time to get that absolutely perfect. So what we need to do now is centralise this central section so that the end just sticks out along the very, very point. It's still just slightly pulling away at the back there. That's just to make our life easier in a moment. So I'm just going to play with that until it sits perfectly centralised. And at this point, you'll probably find any asymmetry in the blade of your sword as well. So you can fix that with just little minor movements to make sure that you're happy. Once you're delighted that that is sitting flat, what we're going to do, I think that's ever so slightly on the wonk actually. So let's just give that a squish until it sits perfectly. You may need to play with the angles at the base of the blade just to get that to sit perfectly symmetrically. That's a little bit better. So what we're going to do now is to trim this very, very tail bit off, and it needs to be just shy of the point. Just shy of the literal point actually. So I'm going to take my flush cutters and just trim that away. Pop that nasty sharp end into the scrap bin. So you can see we've got a little blunt point inside the point of the sword. And what we're going to do now is absolutely crush it. Absolutely crush this. So I'm going to very, very gently pull that away just a little bit more. A little bit of curvature, just slightly higher up the central section of that blade. It's going to be reminiscent of the two chamfered edges coming away to the sides, the cutting sides of the sword. Again, apologies, I'm not a sword expert. I don't know any of the terminology. So what we're going to do now is literally just crush the end of the blade so that it gets almost a hammered effect. And I'm going to do that by using the strongest part of my pliers, which on these ones is the outside edge quite close to the box joint. So you need to be using any flat facing pliers for this. I'm not particularly worried about putting little marks on the blade. Blades tend to be hammered and stuff. So if there's a few tool marks on it, don't worry. You can of course buff them out if that is part of your aesthetic desire. So opening and closing those pliers multiple times, and what I'm doing is I'm pressing it slightly more gently the higher up I go. It doesn't need to happen all the way along. I'd say probably only about a third of the way along. And then when I get down to the very end of this section, I'm absolutely crushing it. So you can see that I am leaving some tool marks, but as I said before, I'm not worried about that. Let's take that to where it's slightly darker. The sun is shining today and I'm not going to shut the curtains because, well, sun is shining. I'm enjoying it. There we go. So that now sits, because we've made it slightly longer by squashing the metal out, it sits perfectly inside the tip of the sword. So what we need to do now is just bring that back down very, very gently, making sure that it's absolutely flat. Now, if you're like me, you tend to apply slightly more pressure on one side than the other, so you may need to just straighten that up gently until it sits exactly where you want it to sit. For the next part and the final part of our sword tutorial today, we're going to apply some banding or binding wire. Now, I've chosen to use 22 gauge 0.6mm half round wire in a contrasting colour, but you obviously do you. This doesn't fall on the cutting part of the blade, so if you wanted to use a slightly heavier round wire, then it's going to look grand, but I have chosen to use that half round. So let's get on to fitting that last section together. So you can obviously take a lot longer than I am to make sure that you're happy and that everything is perfect. You can even very, very gently hammer this design at this stage if you like, as long as you ensure that nothing crosses over the top and everything is kept in that two-dimensional state. So I'm going to be working with 0.6mm 22 gauge half round wire. When you look at half round wire, it's usually coiled with the rounded side outwards and the flat side inwards. But if you're struggling to see, if your eyes are a little bit dodgy like mine, when you hold a section of half round, the half rounded side tends to look a little bit matter, whereas the flat side will have this almost laser-like light falling on it. You'll soon discover when you start wrapping anyway that it might not be quite right. So what I'm going to do is just gently lift up that central portion that we just applied that squashing technique to, and I'm going to wrap around that a couple of times. So if I put just about ½ inch over the top of the rounded side up and the flat side down, what we're going to do is circle that around rather the higher end of that central section of the blade, and you will need to be careful that you're not completely massacring all the work you've put into keeping this straight, but do be aware that you can give that a little bit of a straighten up before the next section of the tutorial. So I'm going to take that around maybe 3 times, and I'm going to trim that wire so that it sits on one side of the blade rather than top or bottom. So let's just get those flush cutters in and steal away that tiny, tiny fragment. Give that a bit of a squish. So what I'm looking for is a nice, neat, tight banding. The other thing that I want to happen is for that wire to appear just on the central section. So I'm going to bring the tail down inside the design. So I've got that coiled around the central section of my blade. Made the camera wobble there, sorry. And then I'm going to pull that to the rear of the design. So I have just slightly unstraightened it, but that's fine. I can give that a little bit of a fix. The reason I want to do that is because I want to start off with just the banding around the centre before I move to taking it all the way around the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the blade. If I coil around that central section and then come away on one side, it doesn't look symmetrical. So I'm just going to pinch that all together. It doesn't need to be super tight, it just needs to be pinched, and drawing that across the surface of all 3 pieces of wire, not going over the top of the preceding section. So it's moved slightly, so I'm just going to give that a quick pinch so that I can draw it back down slightly before banding around all 3 of those wires. And I'm going to do that 2, maybe 3 times while it's still mobile, making sure that the banding is neat and remains the same visible size. So let's take that for a 3rd attempt, all the way around and back over to the right-hand side of the sword, tightening up those bands. Once I'm happy that I've got those first 3 bands neat enough for my desires, you can take a little more time, as I say, I'm going to just hold everything together, making sure that nothing is too crowded, that everything sits side by side in those 2 dimensions, and then I'm going to give it a squish. So squishing it will kind of set the shape, and you'll see that we haven't overly upset that central section by raising it to band around it a few moments ago. It's all looking pretty neat. So I'm going to bring this back into the upright orientation. What can happen when you're working with a half round wire is that it may twist during process, and we don't want that to happen. We want it to all stay the same way up. What I'm doing here is I'm just bringing that central section of just the central banding, let me just raise that slightly, so that it sits flush against the triple banded section, and then I'm going to draw across diagonally, making sure that there's enough space for all 3 wires up at the top. If you find that things have got tight, you can always just open them out slightly by moving the handle over a little bit to one side. So I've gone from bottom right to top left, and what we're going to do now is draw that wire around, always keeping the flat side to the design and the rounded side up, and then I've taken it across the back, and then we're going from top right to bottom left over the top. So we're just tying a little X cross to hold everything neatly together before bringing the wire back across the underneath, back to where it came from. So from the bottom left to top right again. Hold that all the way over, really nice and neat and tidy. Now before I take that next band, I just want to make sure that this is going to sit correctly once I've banded it up the handle of the sword. That all looks nice and neat and tidy. Now one thing that can happen at this stage is that your half round wire will sit on top of the cross section in the very centre. We don't want that, we want it to be above that. So just make sure that you're taking that above, wiggle it into position, and then whiz it over the top and back around. So at this stage it's quite easy to squash it and make the wires cross over one another, whereas we want 1, 2, 3 wires to be side by side. So I'm going to force that into position. Giving it a quick squish will ensure that I can now band the rest of that hilt, handle, whatever it's called, feel free to send me corrections, making sure that everything is sat side by side. Now there's a little bit of a gap just here, but once I've banded it, that's not going to be visible anyway. What we do want is to have a little bit of a gap up at the top, because that's where we're going to be tying off the design in a couple of minutes once we've banded all the way along. So again, the key with this technique is to take your time. Make sure that when you're banding around those 3 wires, you're keeping the flat surface against your sword and the rounded surface upwards, and continue all the way until you get to the top just here. So I've continued with that banding all the way up to the top, keeping the flat side against the sword, the rounded side up, trying to keep my wraps neat and tidy so that they sit flush against one another. And I've stopped just shy of the top so I can show you how to just finish this design off. So I've trimmed to around about 1 inch or so just on the end here, and I'm going to take that one last time over the top, give that a bit of a squish. If I was to continue banding all the way up to the very, very top, that little bubbly section where we made that racetrack hairpin bend, the wire may slip off. So what I'm going to do now is bring this across the back and draw it up inside that little racetrack hairpin section, and then I'm just going to band once or twice around just that section that leads to our spiral where we began. Now you may need to just open that out a little bit more. You'll notice I've slightly kinked the wire there, but I'm not going to worry. Let's just get that last little bit over the top, and I think it's just going to be those 2 turns today. Tighten that banding up, so even though they don't sit flush with the top of the banding here, it looks neat and purposeful. What I'm going to do actually is just flip this over to the back, and you'll see the back of my working doesn't look quite as pretty as the front, but there's very little that's crossing over apart from at that section where everything had to cross over. So I'm just going to open up that last little section of wire so that I can cut it away, so that the cut end sits in between the spiral just here and this section. So let's get that nice and neat and tidy, and then we'll bring that spiral back down into position. You may need to play around with how that sits at the top, like so. And there you have sword number 2. Well, there's a whole bunch of sword number 2. I hope that you've enjoyed making those with me today. I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. In the next couple of months, there will be sword number 4 coming back for you. I'll pop a photograph on the end of the video so you can take a look at those together. And I look forward to seeing you back here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel again very soon. Do take care. Bye for now.